Welcome to today's conversation about building back resiliently. We'll be discussing options for protecting people and the environment as we build back from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. The Woods Institute is Stanford's primary mechanism for bringing people together to discuss, develop, and deliver practical solutions for pressing environmental challenges. Through research, training, and events like this, we strive to chart a path to a sustainable future. The COVID-19 pandemic has delivered the largest economic jolt of my lifetime. We don't yet know the full extent of its social, cultural, political, or environmental consequences. At the same time, the world is reeling to cope with interacting emergencies in health and finance. We're also seeing implications of interactions with other disasters. Most recently, Cyclone Amphan, which yesterday blasted eastern India and Bangladesh. For a single term that captures the essence of these times, my candidate is unprecedented. We truly don't have the history or institutions to navigate based on what's worked in the past. Because there's so much to do to rebuild, there may be opportunities to rebuild better. The goal of today's conversation is to explore some of the options. We'll be digging into questions of how our current situation is creating unprecedented opportunities, as well as challenges. I'm joined today by three experts who work on issues at the interface of the natural world and the human experience. We'll be talking about ideas that are, or should be, in the plans for decision makers plotting the course of rebuilding. We'll focus especially on rebuilding in a way that makes us better prepared for the next disaster, whether it's a pandemic, a flood, or fire related to climate change, or a surge of migrants related to political instability. About 10 years ago, I had the privilege of coordinating the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters. While that project had a sharp focus on impacts from climate change, the main takeaway is that every disaster, independent of the triggering hazard, is to a very large extent shaped by human actions and human decisions. Vulnerability and exposure are controlled by our decisions and our priorities. We always have the potential to increase investments in preparedness, but we rarely do as much as we could. In today's conversation, we'll ask not only why that is, but what we can do to do a better job in the future. Let me introduce today's panelists. Jalonne White-Newsome is a senior program officer at the Kresge Foundation, responsible for the Environment Program's grant portfolio on climate resilient and equitable water systems. She's also an adjunct professor at the George Washington University. Jalonne's academic training includes degrees in environmental health sciences, environmental engineering, and chemical engineering. She was a lead author on the human health chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment. Before joining Kresge in 2016, Jalonne served as director of federal policy at West Harlem Environment Action, where she led national campaigns to ensure that the concerns of low-income communities of color were integrated into federal policy, particularly on issues of clean air, climate change, and health. Gabriele Wong Perotti is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford. Her research focuses on applying behavioral decision research methods to address challenges associated with global environmental change. Gabriele uses behavioral decision science approaches to create evidence-based strategies for informed decision-making, with a particular focus on building resilience and promoting sustainability in the face of a changing climate. She has a background in energy resources, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and risk perceptions of emerging technologies. And finally, Jenny Soucali is an assistant professor of geophysics at Stanford, where she's also a member of the Institute for Computational and Mathematical Engineering. Jenny works on basic understanding and predictive capabilities of complex multi-phase flows that are fundamental to earth science, with specific applications to volcanoes, glaciers, tsunamis, and magma oceans. Prior to graduate school, she worked as a scientific consultant for international organizations that are aiming to reduce the impact of natural and environmental disasters in vulnerable communities. This interest in human dimensions of disaster risk reduction has stuck, leading Jenny to integrate geophysical and social perspectives in her research and teaching. Both Gabriele and Jenny are center fellows at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Let me start questions with Jalonne. And Jalonne, why is it that the same communities seem to get hit the most, whether it's from COVID or any other crisis, and particularly true for climate change?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, for your question. And thank you all for the opportunity to be here. And I know we're supposed to talk about kind of building back resiliently and kind of the post-pandemic, but I definitely want to start out by acknowledging those that are responding to this pandemic right now. So thank you to all that are, again, in our hospitals, our communities, in so many different ways, helping communities get through this. And so, Chris, to your question of why certain communities continue to get hurt and hit repeatedly, it's really a question of kind of the systems and the institutions and the policies and practices that have been in place, but really in a place that only protects certain communities and certain people, and unfortunately lets certain communities and other people feel the brunt and get left out, and in fact be invisible in many cases. And so there's a lot of things that we can think about, but when it comes down to it, the root cause is that we have policies that are really built on racism. We have structures and institutions that are not protective of our communities, particularly the low-income communities, undocumented citizens, communities of color. And this pandemic is not the only place or case where we've seen this play out. It's been decades of racism that have made these infrastructures and these institutions that we rely on consistently not able to protect those that can be most vulnerable in a pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. Let me stick sort of with this theme of the relationship between responses to COVID-19 and other disasters with a question for Jenny. And what similarities do you see between the way that COVID-19 has played out and other kinds of disasters play out in the US and around the world?
Great question, Chris. So yes, both my research group, we work on multiple different disasters, and also while working for the UN, I've been part of the response team to multiple disasters and the preparation team to multiple disasters. And while each event is absolutely unique in many of its aspects, there really is one common theme. And I think that is that disasters expose and to some degree exacerbate an existing dynamics in the society. So they really pick up where we left off. So in some sense, I think of them as these grotesque, distorted mirrors you can find in science museums or children's museums sometimes that reflect ourselves back to us and our past choices back to us. And so, as Jalonne mentioned, a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now in terms of a lack of inclusion of minorities, a lack of a disproportionate burden on low income communities, particularly families, all of these issues were always there. The political divisions that we're struggling with in our decision making, all of these dynamics were already there. And COVID-19 just kind of puts a spotlight on them and highlights just how problematic those kinds of issues were. And also I think is a real opportunity for us to revisit and think more creatively about what is the society we want to build, right? This is an opportunity to learn, and this is an opportunity to do better.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's exactly the motivation for today's conversation. Let me stick with this theme, moving to Gabriele. So a lot of the issues are structural and enforced by decades of relationships among people, but other aspects are really coming from internal perceptions and from the resilience that people feel internally. And can you comment on the way that kind of self-image and mental health contribute to the way that disasters play out?
Yeah, I think the picture is somewhat complicated, and I totally agree with what Jalonne and Jenny just mentioned, that a lot of it is structural. But we do see that there are differences with respect to how people are resilient in the face of disasters, even within certain communities. And so we can look in the past in the literature and sociology and psychology that give us some insight about what does resilience mean at the individual level. And we're seeing some, and some of the work that we've been doing, some interesting patterns emerging. So for example, individuals that suffer from PTS or post-traumatic stress as a result of experiencing an extreme event like a hurricane that post-traumatic stress can linger on for years. And conversely, that could make people actually more prepared for future events, because some of the markers of PTS are things like vigilance and kind of preparing more. And so we see that kind of behavior happening, but at the same time, PTS is also associated with high levels of anxiety or stress, which could then manifest in greater disease burden. So we're seeing things like higher associated rates of cardiovascular disease among individuals that are exposed to traumatic extreme weather events. And we are seeing, as we're seeing some of the anecdotal evidence with respect to COVID, it breaking down by racial and income lines. We also see that to be the case with how people are responding over the long term in terms of poorer health outcomes like cardiovascular disease in the face of extreme weather events, with groups like African Americans and other minority populations suffering the most.
Jalonne, help me understand the relationship between these, the structural factors like racism that have marginalized communities and the way that individuals bring forward the sort of personal resilience in order to engage effectively with rebuilding. How do we think about those, especially when we think about what the lessons learned are that are going to put us on a better, stronger trajectory in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Gabriele says is striking and really interesting, because there was this wonderful organization in Los Angeles, grassroots organization that has a definition of resilience that I think ties into this. I mean, we typically hear the definitions of resilience, bounce back, bounce forward, bounce around, whatever you want to say, but their definition is basically the purpose of resilience is not to build back the capacity to endure more trauma. Like inherently, our communities of color, our low-income communities are resilient by nature because they've had to be, because they have taken on more than most have. And so as we think about the structural factors and why it's so important that as we think about building back post-pandemic or post-crisis, that if we don't start to disrupt those structures, that eventually resilience, you can only be so resilient. You can only have so much trauma. And the fact that when we think about from the public health perspective, stress kills. So I think about my mom who suffered a year ago with flooding in her home. We just had a bunch of rain in Michigan, and that fear and that stress from the flooding that happened last year that hasn't been remedied for many structural reasons, whether it's lack of government attention, whether it's not getting, her not feeling healthy from, the air quality, like that stress adds and it accumulates. And so I guess when we think about resilience, it's thinking about those structures that we need to disrupt, but also realizing that people can only take so much and they should only have to take so much. So I'm very passionate about that. Like, how do we keep people first in what we do, but also address and attack the source of the problem?
What an important point, that it's not about being more resilient to repeated trauma. It's to decrease the risk that you get exposed to that trauma. And people are naturally resilient if we can keep things within bounds. Jenny, I know a lot of your work on disaster resilience has been in really impoverished communities, Southeast Asia. And what are the things that you take away from looking at these really, really poor communities in terms of the factors that can make the most difference for either being resilient or being less exposed to the hazards that occur?
I think it's a really great point. And I have to admit that, like one of my first projects when I worked for the UN was in the Southwest Pacific. So those are the island states, essentially east of Australia. And it's a lot of the communities I worked in were very impoverished. But I think to me, the key learning was that I've never seen community as resilient, right? Like we often make this assumption that just because you're poor, you're not resilient, when in fact, as Jalonne said, you're all the more resilient. In fact, I've never met communities as resilient as some of the communities in the Southwest Pacific. And I think one of the reasons that they were is because they had an authentic response to a problem. So here is an example. When I worked for the UN, one of the projects that we were involved in were earthquake safety. So basically building safety during earthquakes. Now, at first you might think, well, what could possibly be wrong with trying to protect a building against earthquake shaking, right? Like all of these, civil engineering measures we have to reduce damage in a shaking building. That sounds like a great idea, right? And then we got there, and the communities, many of the impoverished communities in particular, were living in houses that were actually meant to collapse. Right. And it was a brilliant strategy when you think of it, right? Like the houses were exceedingly lightly built. So when they collapse, they would not hurt anyone, right? Like that's the main problem in a collapsing building, obviously. And they were very easy to bring up again, right? So you were not dependent on any government help to sort of build up your building. They had adapted to the situation. And I think to me, the key learning from that is that I think what resilience is and isn't, and what makes a community resilient is very individual, right? Like you need to have a measure, if you want to support resilient, you need to have a measure that is authentic to the community. So for example, the UN project I worked in, if you try to build concrete houses, however earthquake resilient they might be, it will always be a lot worse than what is there at the moment, because the current strategy is perfect in many ways, right? Like it has maybe other issues in terms of protection from rain and weather events, and there might be other issues that you want to focus on. But from an earthquake point of view, it's a brilliant strategy. And it is one that the community has come up with themselves, and it is authentic to them. They know how to rebuild their houses, and it makes them stronger. And I think the key lesson from that is you don't want to walk into a community like that and impose your own vision of resilience onto them, because then you're only going to make it worse. Right? So I think it also goes to Gabriele's point, which is that resilience is a very individual capacity. And I think we need to be more thoughtful in understanding what makes current communities resilient and support their efforts, but support their efforts in a way that is authentic to the way they think about community, to the way they think about maybe even fundamental values like the house is my castle. Maybe they don't, think of it that way, right? Look, I feel like that's the key lesson to me is resilience needs to be authentic to the communities that you're trying to support.
Gabriele, I think this concept that you don't need to be rich in order to be resilient, and that resilience has different faces in different places is a really important one. But all the examples we've talked about today speak to a strong social fabric and a kind of a starting point where people have the internal resources to be resilient, even if they don't have a lot of financial resources. Would you say that's true in your experience?
I would say that there's variation among individuals in certain communities with respect to their ability to withstand stressors. But I think when you're talking about the fabric of a community, I think that is quite important. And we do see that social networks, social ties, social support is very important for people to be able to withstand shocks. And then again, we see some variability with respect to that as well. So some individuals who feel like they have a very, very high level of social support, or they say they have very, very low levels of social support, we're seeing in terms of preparing for future hazardous events that those individuals are preparing less. On the one hand, for those who have low levels of social support, they just don't have people around them to help them. They don't have those resources to help them. Those individuals with extremely high levels of support may feel like they have a safety net that they can just fall back onto, and they don't have to do anything to prepare because there's going to be people there to help support them. Those individuals that kind of have moderate levels of support tend to have the most resources to be able to do something about it, and the more motivation to do something about it. They see themselves as being at higher risk. So I think, it's a complicated picture, but on balance, having that kind of social fabric, that social support is really important for helping people face trauma and also prepare for future trauma if that should occur.
And Jalonne, when we think about building back resiliently and enhancing internal personal resilience at the same time we talk about tackling some of these institutional and racism-based policies that have marginalized communities? How should we think about first steps in making that kind of progress, and where are the pressure points where we can make things change?
Boy, I mean, that's a great question. And I guess kind of building off of what Gabriele shared, I thought about the heat wave that happened in Chicago in 1995. And a lot of my research has been on heat waves and their impacts on populations that are vulnerable to those climate extremes, primarily the elderly and the low income. And so the importance, as Gabriele said, of kind of that social network and social cohesion is so critical, because oftentimes our communities are the first responders. So for me, as we think about building back more resiliently, we have to invest in the people infrastructure as much as we invest in the physical infrastructure. And so you might ask, what does that mean? So as a funder in my position now, we're finding, over the past 8 or 9 weeks of this quarantine, that we need to forego some things that aren't priorities right now. Like right now, it's about helping stabilize communities if they need, funding for masks, if they need funding to manage the digital divide because they can't do their work because folks don't have access to internet and things of that nature. Those are the type of things that we need to focus on. And so I even think as we look at this, the COVID pandemic, we support a group of community health workers in the state of Michigan that have been underfunded, actually defunded in many ways. But these community health workers, while they don't, climate change isn't their major thing, they are the ones that are being deployed for COVID, for climate, for all these pieces. So again, how do we shore up and invest in these already existing infrastructures, both informal and formal infrastructures that have, again, that high touch with the community already, that if we get them readied and prepared and educated, and they already have that trust and relationship in community, then that is where we need to begin and start our focus, because those are the ones that are responding right now. Because in a lot of cases, the same communities that we're talking about, the low-income communities, the poor communities, they are at the end of the line for a response. They're at the end of the line for receiving resources. So how do we begin to, again, take care of ourselves until the other folks come?
This theme that's coming out in answers from all of you about the importance of building back with personal and relationship-based and interrelationship-based mechanisms, as opposed to just thinking about the physical infrastructure. A really important theme. Jenny, you've thought a lot about the specific physical hazards, and I wonder, is the theme that's coming from our conversation that we really don't need to be thinking as much about what the physical hazards are, and that we should think more about this human capability? Or is there a kind of a partnership where the right decisions about understanding the physical hazards can make it easier for us to invest in the kind of personal resources that have been the theme so far?
One of the challenges in climate change, particularly to me, is that it's very difficult to know what kind of disaster we'll be dealing with, right? Like as the current situation illustrates. Last year, everyone was really worried about wildfires, at least here in California, for very understandable reasons. 2 or 3 years before, we were really worried about sea level rise. Now we're really worried about a pandemic, right? So, and all of these concerns are obviously justified. And all of these sort of physical events is something that we need to think about and deal with. I think one of the reasons that I'm particularly interested in the interplay between the physical and the social at the moment is partly because I feel like historically we've prioritized the physical side quite a bit. So for example, we think a lot about flood risk, and very often flood risk was primarily cast as, where do I build the dam? Like how do I deal with this physically? And I think that's just, it's not wrong or anything, but it's just one side of the coin, right? Like it is, a disaster itself is fundamentally a human disaster. I actually don't like the term natural disaster. I feel like it's a misnomer. The physical event doesn't kill people. It's always the social dynamics that really lead you to the disastrous element of this. And so I think one of the reasons why I think emphasizing the social dimension of this more is because I think with climate change, we don't know what we're going to be dealing with, and probably a mix of all the above. And I feel like the power of thinking about resilience to me is that it will help in all of these cases, because fundamentally all of these cases expose and exacerbate the existing dynamics of the society. So I feel like in some sense, investing in that, as new or sort of odd as that might sound at first, I think is crucial for making sure that our investments really get, that we get the best return on our investments. And we only, I feel like, are starting to really have deep conversations about that, where I feel like the physical infrastructure is something we talked about for a long time. And yes, it's definitely important, but it's kind of a yin and yang sort of thing, the way I think about it. And we've talked a lot about one side, but not so much about the other.
Restore the balance, yeah. You know, this question of being willing to invest in preparedness is super central to the disaster risk reduction paradigm. And there are lots and lots of studies that show the high value of investing in preparation over investing in response. And a lot of that willingness to invest has to do with people's perception of the risks they face. And Gabriele, do you think that we do an okay job of helping people across society understand that the risks they face and the value of investments in preparation?
I think this goes to kind of Jenny's point. I think understanding both the physical risks as well as the social risks are really important, and you need one in order to inform the other, and kind of what to do or how to plan in terms of thinking about resilience. With respect to risk perceptions, do I think we're doing a good job communicating what climate-related impacts are going to be, or kind of these human-caused crises or disasters that we see as they unfold? You know, I think it kind of depends on where you are at, and I think unfortunately some of these issues are becoming more and more partisan, which in my opinion they shouldn't be. And so I think that complicates the communication of climate-related risks, of human-caused disasters. And I think that in terms of people's perceptions and understanding of the risk, it depends on where they're at. So if you go to any small island nation, they probably are very aware of the issues related to coastal flooding and sea level rise. And, you know, we see this in the Gulf Coast as well. People are very aware of what the risks are. But what could be communicated better, I think, to individuals is thinking about how to prepare for those risks, how those risks may change, because people tend to use heuristics, or they think about historically what has happened to them. But we are moving into an era of unprecedented change, where things may be becoming more severe than people had anticipated before. And this may be in conflict with people's desire to kind of stay and be in places where they love and they find home, and that's where their community is. So when we think about resilience, when we think about building, we need to meet people where they're at, their understanding of the risks, the things that they're doing now, and what we suggest to them must be culturally and behaviorally appropriate and realistic for them to do.
And Jalonne, when we think about increasing investments in building both resilience to the physical risks and this kind of social capital, do you think of that as pulling resources away from something else that would be economically viable, or are there ways that we can target these investments so that they're working for us both in the short term in terms of advancing, you know, economic goals and justice-oriented goals at the same time that they're building resilience?
Definitely. I mean, I think we need to be more elegant in our thinking, and part of when I was working on the Hill as a lobbyist for an environmental justice organization, I mean, that is the case that we had to make, that you know, as much as we need to build our social infrastructure, we need to build our physical infrastructure. So we can do both, but the question is, it's how you do it. And oftentimes I would share with folks is that, you know, you need to, what I call, do an equity analysis, right? So you begin to ask the questions, who benefits, who doesn't? If I do it this way, will it make things more jacked up for certain communities? Or is there a way that we can get multiple benefits out of this solution? Whether it be a physical infrastructure solution, a policy solution, whatever. So I think we have to begin to think about this holistically. We have to begin to think about things intersectionally, and we have to make sure that when we come up with these solutions, that we have all of the right people at the table. So it's not just the engineers and the scientists, but it's those impacted communities that Jenny spoke to, saying, you know, they are already, to me, solutioneers in their own right. Like, that is an awesome example. And so how do we begin to like pulling all these different parts of the puzzle so the art that we end up with is something that is going to be beneficial to everyone? So I think there is a way we can do it. We just have to get out of our norms and get out of our comfort zone and be willing to take a little bit of risk, but always kind of have this equity analysis, you know, going on in our heads, and ask those tough questions while we're in the process and not just at the end.
And I know, Jalonne, you've worked a lot on both sides of this issue with the community-based organizations and with the sort of the elites and the governments. Is there, what are the things we should be putting more emphasis on in order to encourage that multiple voices, multiple direction conversation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's some simple things, and you know, one of the, if you can say it, the beauties of a crisis is that people begin to talk to people that they haven't talked to before. And, you know, you begin to make friends with folks that you're like, oh, I could never work with them. So I think we have to use these crises as opportunities to not only build back better and different, but also to begin having relationships with people that we've never kind of thought before, that we've never created before. So I think, you know, as we move forward, something someone said, I can't remember, it's important to remember that when you have these collective tables of folks that hopefully have a shared vision of building back something that's more resilient, that we appreciate the values that people bring. So what I value might be different than your value. But what I always go back to is that when we have understanding of what's important, for me, it might be making sure my children's school is safe. For a congressional person on the Hill, it might be, you know, making sure that my person gets reelected. And in order to do that, we have to have some type of economic stimulus. For an engineer, it might be proving out this certain technology. So how do we appreciate and value each other's unique perspectives, but bring all that in the room and create something new and beautiful that again achieves the shared vision that hopefully we can co-create together? So if we don't have all those perspectives, if we don't have the community perspective, the engineer and all these folks, we're going to lose out. So I think that's where it's exciting, but it's hard work. Collaboration is hard, but that's what we have to do. And that's what we have to shoot for if we're ever gonna, you know, kind of get past our multiple crises.
Let me just take 1 second to remind people in the audience that we'll be transitioning to questions from me to questions from all of you. If you enter them in the Q&A box, and we have a few questions to start with, but I'd love to see a few more. And this theme about how individual priorities differ and how the definition of resilience is going to vary from person to person is really central to the things I'm hearing about ways to make progress. Gabriele, are there communications tools or empowering mechanisms we should be thinking about in order to help people refine their visions and to empower them to take the kind of action that Jalonne is talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the moment that we're in, Jalonne, that you mentioned, I think is really powerful. And you know, this is not a tool per se, but I mean, this could be an inflection point where we say as a society, this is how we want to move forward. This is our vision for the future. We need to make some real investments right now in order to think about resiliency in a more equitable way, where we are reducing people's exposure to hazards, to disasters where we are taking care of our own and really building stronger communities. So I think that this is really a moment for us to think about it and to reflect upon it and think about what we can do as citizens in order to try to have our voices be heard, that this is what we want. In terms of kind of tools and communications that are out there to help people think about these issues, I think a number of tools exist in terms of just communicating about the COVID crisis. There are a number of tools that are climate-related tools that are out there that help individuals ranging from private citizens to planners to journalists that are communicating about issues such as sea level rise to community members. One of them that I worked on with Climate Central is Searching Seas Risk Finder as an example. And the lessons there are that you need to present information that shows people the risks, benefits, and uncertainties inherent in the data that's shown, and also the solutions that people may take, and that those solutions need to be co-created with the audience with whom you intend to assist. So they need to be realistic, culturally appropriate, in a language that people can understand and use, and appropriate for the resources and constraints that they face. And if you can reduce some of those barriers, people tend to be more receptive to that information and actually use that information to inform their decision-making about preparation. So those are just kind of some high-level things to think about when we think about helping people inform their decision-making.
Jenny, you've worked with a lot of international disaster response organizations. Do you have examples of what's worked and what hasn't in terms of the priorities that Gabriele has talked about, especially the idea of co-creation and understandable and personally relevant?
Right. So to me, I think this concept of co-creation is absolutely essential to this, because I think, I think one of the things we tend to forget as people who are focused on risk is people don't live to minimize risk. They live to maximize well-being, right? So if we only focus on risk, we're always going to lose out on connecting to anyone, right? Like it's, in some sense, even thinking about risk is a luxury, right? Like in one of the community workshops we had, like one man walked in and he asked me, is this going to help me feed my kids? If yes, I'm in. If no, I'm out. And that's, I'm a mom, I get it, that's your priority. I totally sympathize with that. So I think the idea of co-creation is so important for a variety of reasons. One, because some of the elements we already touched on, it needs to be authentic, it needs to be culturally relevant, right? Like it needs to start from the actual needs of the community, but also from the strength of the community, right? As I said, many communities are actually very resilient in a very intuitive sort of way. So for example, in many of the Southwest Pacific languages, there actually is no word for planning. So it's not an intentional, and when you ask the communities, they cannot explain to you how they will necessarily respond to a flood. But when the flood happens, their response is pretty much picture perfect, right? So people do a lot of things to minimize the risk in just an intuitive way. So I think it needs to start from an understanding of the community. And the only way you can get there, in my opinion, is through a dialogue, right? Like as Jalonne said, we all have different perspectives, we all have different values, and that needs to be incorporated into an approach if it can be successful.
The examples that Jenny raises are really interesting and compelling. They also speak to what we might think about as relatively high probability risks. And one of the things that's happening increasingly in this era of globalization, in the era of climate change, is that we face an increasing probability of risks that are truly unprecedented and where the cultural traditions and the historical experience hasn't really nailed down the kind of experience that lets people be successful. I'll just start with Jen. Do you have a feel for whether or not this sort of intuitive resilience that you've spoken about helps in these unprecedented risks?
Right. I think that's a great question, right? And that's always how I felt like that's the strength of these scientifically, or like these co-produced kind of ideas, right? Is because I think you need to start from the intuition that people have, because your intuition will always inform your response, right? But as you say, your intuition is based, or as Gabriele said, like it's based on a heuristic of what happened in the past. So it might or might not be, applicable. But then I think it's worth, and that's, I feel like, where sort of scientists and risk analysts can really help make a difference, is think through, how is this going to generalize for this or that case, right? Like, how is this approach that you might intuitively pick, or that you might intuitively gravitate to, how is that going to generalize for this kind of scenario? And then walk through that hypothetically and see, like, where are some of the limitations, right? Like, I entirely agree with you. A lot of these, resilient strategies have their limits, but usually I think I feel like that is the unique perspective and role that risk analysts play in these co-production kind of efforts, is that you can help think through those kinds of consequences, because you, from your work, probably have a better idea what those low probability events would be. And I agree, sometimes the strategy generalizes and sometimes it does not. But I think it still needs to start from the intuition of the community, because that's going to be what they naturally gravitate towards.
And Gabriele, does your work on risk perception suggest some things about what strategies might be effective for expanding the conversation from the experience risks to these unprecedented ones?
Yeah, I mean, this goes to trust and credibility of the source. And so when people use this example sometimes, when people make decisions, like imagine that a tornado is coming. How do you make your decision? You probably get a tweet maybe from the National Weather Service saying that there's a tornado warning and then a tornado watch. Or maybe it's a watch and warning, I always get this flipped, but at any rate, you hear that a tornado is coming from some official source. You're sitting in a cafe eating lunch. You look outside, you actually see a tornado coming at you, but what is the first thing that people do? Is they look around themselves and they're like, oh, that couple over there, they're sitting and they're continuing to eat their sandwich. Maybe something is not wrong. So the point being is that we take our cues predominantly from the people around us, from the people that we know, from the people that we trust, the people that we love. And we often use that kind of as the first line of defense if we don't have a lot of information about what a risk is. We rely on other people to help us inform that decision making, especially for these kind of low probability, high impact events. And so, and when we think about that, we think about how we might engage with or collaborate with some of those trusted communicators in communities to really leverage those relationships when we're talking about mitigating climate change or addressing the impacts of climate change. So I think that's something that's important to consider with respect to risk communications. Although scientists and academics tend to have pretty high levels of trust, it's variable depending upon the community or the population that you're trying to engage with. So I think really trying to identify those trusted communicators for that audience is essential.
Great. There's a series of wonderful questions in the Q&A box, and I feel like they flow very naturally from the conversation we've been having, and I'll start asking some of those, but other panelists should feel free to jump in. Let me start with kind of, building on this issue of the how you think about partitioning your effort. And I'll start with Jalonne. This is a question from Lorene von Klon. She says, many people are thinking about rebuilding with economic rebuilding as a priority to create jobs through construction. And how should we augment this with the need to set up, to disrupt systems that set up the trauma? What's the key for getting multiple impacts out of the investments we make?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Boy, I mean, I appreciate that question. I think it goes a little bit back to what my other panelists have shared. In order to not repeat the trauma or the crisis, I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that it has happened. And a lot, when you talk about building trust and building partnership, whether it's between community and government, community and the local public health department, for communities of color and low-income communities and some poor communities, again, that trust has been broken. And that is super important as you talk about creating whatever that next thing is that will hopefully mediate the trauma. So the first thing when either I go into a community that I'm not from, or I'm trying to interface with different folks, is how do we begin to acknowledge what's happened? And in most cases, it hasn't been a good thing. Acknowledge that and realize that there has to be a healing process that happens. And sometimes that takes time. And so once you get through that acknowledgement and healing process, then it's about, okay, so, you know, I think about this whole concept of community-based participatory research. And a part of that, in ways that I've been involved, CPPR, whatever you want to call it, is that typically you have folks that maybe haven't worked together that have different, you know, as a scientist, you might want to grab some data on this, but as a community member, you don't much maybe care about the data more so than jobs in your community. So when you talk about community-based participatory research, or as to your question, kind of building up the economics in a certain community where it doesn't cause multiple traumas, it's like, how do we create something together that meets the need of that community while also getting at some of these other additional benefits? So I say that because, you know, again, if we all come in with our own separate agendas and are not open to appreciating what other people want and value out of the process, or discounting it or not listening to it, then that trauma is going to repeat. So whether it's, for example, in this day and age, as on the Hill, they're having conversations around COVID response monies and stimulus and all that stuff. One of the pieces, the many pieces, is around economic development, particularly as you think about shoring up water infrastructure and making sure that jobs are available for those people in those communities. How do we put in, you know, again, those policies that are going to make sure that when these monies come down, if they get to those communities, that those jobs, again, are slated for those community members and will be a benefit, while also shoring up, you know, that they might be able to handle the next flood and yada, yada, yada. So I think, again, acknowledge what happened. There needs to be a healing process to build that trust. Understand, using a CBPR model, that everybody has different values, and try and create something that everybody gets a piece of what they want. I think would be my quick answer.
And recognizing that when you do make investments in rebuilding infrastructure, those can either serve to reinforce the trauma, or they can serve to decrease the trauma moving forward. Let me follow on with that with a question from Tom Holzer about how you make progress going in that direction. The question reads, how do we rebuild resiliency in a country which is divided into groups with different and often conflicting and sometimes anti-science core values? And maybe each of you would like to weigh in on this, because it kind of, it cuts to aspects of points that each of you has raised. Jalonne, do you want to start?
Oh boy, can you repeat the last part of that?
Well, I mean, the basically is you know, what's the role of the partisanship and social divisions, and how do we achieve the kinds of steps that you say we need in the context of a society with such deep divisions?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, that's the question of the century, but I would just say the way that I've approached it before is that you have to know or do your homework to figure out what that other person cares about. So oftentimes, I'll just give an example. I go into offices on the Hill and I know this particular person does not believe in climate change, hates science, you know, could care less about what environmental justice means regardless. But what I do know is that this person has a grandchild that has asthma. What I do know is that this person grew up in a small rural community where, you know, economics were tight and all this stuff. So the goal is that we each have to figure out, what is that thing that connects us? What is that thing that people value and care about, and use that to build the case. And so again, it takes doing your homework, it takes time. And even in this very unfortunately divided nation that we sit in, you know, there are threads that tie us together. I believe, like, and maybe this is Pollyannish, but, you know, we are more alike than we are different. We are all human and we have our shared experiences, but it is our job as humans to appreciate and understand what each of our experiences are, and find that common thread that, you know, I care about my family. I want to take care of them. I want to be able to sustain myself. And so what are those common threads that we can begin to, again, build something on? And that's not easy because, you know, politics and, you know, all sorts of things come into play. But, you know, I'm a firm believer that, you know, again, you begin to plant different seeds, and some seeds might grow. Some seeds, they might take a little bit more time and a little bit of watering, but you go where you have some traction, continue to water and, you know, plant those seeds. And you never know, like, I feel like crises, you know, sometimes are able to make that other seed sprout that wouldn't. So again, we have to figure out what our common values are, what our common threads are, go with kind of the seeds that, you know, we can nurture and grow now to get the ball rolling, but continue to not leave out those folks that might not see it the way we see it, but still need to be watered and nurtured.
Gabriele, perspectives for an environmental psychologist on how to think about the role of partisanship and social fracturing and bringing people together?
Yeah, Jalonne, you're right. The question of the century, definitely. So I wholeheartedly agree that understanding who you're speaking with, who you're engaging with, and understanding their values and their perspective and their experience, where they come from, is essential to having a conversation. And this is actually along the lines of what Jenny mentioned earlier. You know, what are the benefits? And so maybe the central motivation isn't around adapting to climate change or, you know, talking about the COVID outbreak and vaccines and things like that that could be controversial. Maybe it's talking about other things that we care about. And again, kind of going to Jalonne's point, what are the people's values? Are there solutions or ways forward where we can build up multiple things that we as a community, we as a society care about, that tend to have co-benefits, that may address climate change adaptation, that may address some of the other things that we care about, environmental destruction, that we can move forward on. But it is challenging, and perhaps, you know, depending upon the audience with whom you're engaging with or the communities you're engaging with, it may not be a one-size-fits-all message. The message may have to be tailored to the communities that you're engaging with. And that, again, is kind of doing your homework, understanding the situation, the community, the cultural context, the social context, and so on.
Jenny, I don't mean to always task you with the international perspective on each of these issues, but we do now see some international fracturing that's greater than it has been in past decades as well. And
right.
How do we think about addressing that in the context of resilience?
Right. I mean, okay, so I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all, right? So all I can offer is sort of my personal opinion and experience here. And I think a lot of that is informed from when I was based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And I was working for UNESCO, and clearly a very divided country, much more so than we are when it comes to racism and other issues. And one of the things that I thought was an inspiration when I was there is the intentional reconciliation programs that were run. And I was involved at this for the schools, which used to be segregated. And then there was an attempt to integrate them, but obviously there were a lot of barriers to that really working out. And I do sometimes wonder, and I guess this is just a question to you all to think about, and I don't want to advocate one way or the other, but I do wonder whether one of the things that would actually be valuable is some sort of national reconciliation program in which we just kind of try to talk to each other more and try to find ways to moderate that dialogue, almost like not even necessarily focusing on COVID-19. But I feel like, COVID-19, as all other disasters, it exposes existing problems. It exposes existing dynamics, right? So that why don't we just try to fix that? And I mean, just is obviously a vast, dramatic understatement, but I think it is an opportunity to focus not necessarily on the particular problem, but on the underlying dynamics. And I think the political divisions really are a problem in every aspect of political life. It's not just COVID related, it's education, it's environmental policy, it's economic policy, it's lots of things. So I actually wonder sometimes whether it would be good to try to come up with some sort of reconciliation kind of effort in which you just kind of try to facilitate more debates among different people, and you try to get them to meet each other. And instead of everyone talking to people who are like them on social media, maybe try to facilitate in-person meetings with people that are a little bit different than you, right? Like maybe people that still have some similarity with you, but also those that are a little bit different. And, there are political scientists working on that, and maybe they have some clever ideas about how to facilitate that sort of dialogue. But I really think that in some sense, I think really becoming serious about resilience means becoming serious about the fundamental frustrations we all have about the dynamics in our society at a very general level. And these reconciliation programs have been run in a bunch of countries. And we might think that, we don't need that sort of stuff because obviously, we haven't gone through, that degree of war scenarios or, but you don't have, I think they, from my experience anyways in Johannesburg, I felt like it was the only way forward is to start talking to each other instead of shooting each other, right? Like it seemed like maybe, it wasn't perfect and, it's a difficult thing to do, but I didn't really see any alternatives. So for what it's worth, I thought these kinds of efforts were really worth it and really helped make some progress on these very fundamental divisions.
So make an explicit investment in tackling the partisanship. At the same time, we're making investments in restoring jobs and protecting public health.
Right.
Let me change gears a little bit and ask a question. This one comes from Ishan Shadavedi, and it relates to the kind of essence of the sustainable development agenda and whether that's been challenged by the way the pandemic's unfolded. And the question is, are there implications from the improvements in environmental quality indices that we've seen as a result of the lockdowns that somehow fundamentally challenge our idea of what we've been trying to accomplish with a sustainable development agenda? Jenny, you might start with that one because I know that sustainable development has been a theme and you're thinking over many years. And were we headed in the wrong direction, or do we have new insights about what sustainable development means now that we've experienced the consequences of COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think sustainable development, clearly is and should be informed by what happens by COVID-19, just because, again, I think COVID-19 highlights some gaps in how we pursue that goal. And I think, to me, we think about, so there are these different strands of like sustainability, resilience, and equity, but the more I think about it, the more I gravitate towards integrating them, because I think fundamentally they really are different sides of the same coin. So I think, and that's, one of the key motivations behind a lot of international disaster management work is actually to enable sustainable development, so that you don't invest in sustainable development and then each hurricane sets you back to where you were 10 years ago, right? So like there's always that interconnectedness between resilience and sustainability. And I think we need to embrace that a little bit more, to think about sort of resilience as an enabler of sustainability and as a component of sustainability. So yes, I think there are important lessons here. And I think I would add equity to it as sort of a really important third dimension, which in some sense is inherent to sustainable development, but is not always made as explicit.
Jalonne, the vocabulary of sustainable development is usually one we apply at the international scale and not so much when we think about local scale issues and local scale politics. But a lot of the institutional racism that you've spoken at also has a very strong economic overlay. And I wonder if there is a new vision of kind of sustainable development within a nation that might emerge as a consequence of our thinking about COVID-19?
So I think when we talk about sustainable development and what that means, particularly in the States, a couple things come to mind. I think about what causes us to have development that is unsustainable. And the fact is that because of institutional and systemic racist practices, there are certain communities that just don't even have the opportunity or resources to develop in a sustainable way. So the way I'm thinking about it is how do we change that? So one example is the fact that we supported an organization in Mississippi to do a study of really looking at in 5 southern states how clean water funding was distributed and map that out, against socioeconomic variables. And, while there's always been this anecdotal, thing that, most communities of color, rural communities, small to medium-sized cities, don't get those funds to, again, build up their water infrastructure. This study actually made it plain. And so, again, it's like this question of why does this continue to happen, whether it's a crisis or whether it's just the same process that happens a little bit different in every state as to how those federal funds come down to states and how they're deployed. So as we think about sustainable development, you have to think about the existing processes that are in place that are not working for everybody. And so particularly with state revolving loan funds that are typically used to, help water infrastructure or develop it, there are barriers that exist in those cities and those communities that, range from technical capacity, range from not having shovel-ready projects ready to go, range from folks not being connected to the state, or, all these different barriers that are not insurmountable. And I think if we're ever going to get to something sustainable, we have to have a process that's sustainable, a process that's inclusive, a process that doesn't continue to leave out time and time again the same cities and communities and people. And so the water infrastructure piece is just one example, but I could play that out in so many different sectors, whether it's education, transportation, et cetera. So to me, when we talk about sustainability, we have to, again, get to those root causes, but really look at what is this process and why is it not working and how we're going to change it.
Yeah. This theme of empowering people in all aspects of society and all walks of life is really central to progress moving forward. I want to switch to another question. This one's from Dan Clore, and I'll start by asking Gabriele. And it's about this issue of sort of empowering voices, but also how you think about the mix between bottom up and top down. It's asked in terms of control of behavior, but you can think about it as empowerment too. As COVID responses move forward, I'm reading now, we've seen a conflict between bottom up and top down control of our behavior, rules versus freedom. And how do we think about future steps in integrating rules versus freedom as we try and shift toward a more sustainable path forward and a more inclusive approach to decision making?
Okay, great. I think that's a great point. We're seeing with COVID-19 a lot of resistance to measures like social distancing and sheltering in place and wearing masks, in part because of this concern about civil liberties, but also in part because people are hurting and want to go back to work, and that totally makes sense. I get that. The balance of protecting your health versus economic interests versus, frankly, mental health issues as well. Being socially isolated is very, in many cases, not good for people's mental health. So in terms of kind of that balance, what we are seeing with respect to masks, just kind of anecdotally, and we're also assessing this in some studies that we're doing, is a tremendous and quickly moving landscape in terms of how social norms are shifting. Where just months ago, the idea of wearing masks outside for many people, that was unpalatable in the US. It's kind of a very strange thing to do, but now it's quickly becoming normalized. And people have their own masks, they're customizing them, putting names on them, decorating them. So I think that, once some of these types of solutions and behaviors become normalized, and again, leveraging social influence and social norms, these things can kind of become a part of practice and are accepted. So again, it kind of goes back to this notion of who are your communicators? Where's this information coming from? Who are the influencers for these types of behaviors? And I think you probably do need to have a bit of both, top down and bottom up, because from, we know that policies and things like that, and we're seeing evidence of this, of sheltering in place, have been quite effective in terms of helping to reduce the numbers of people who become infected with COVID-19. So I think that's really important, but buy-in is really important. And I actually was thinking about the previous question. I thought you were going to ask me to respond to that. So I had a thought about that.
Please go ahead.
If that's okay.
And sure.
And so this is in terms of sustainable development and in terms of a development at the community level. And I was actually thinking about some of the work that I did reviewing Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan process, which from a lot of different perspectives has been quite effective in terms of developing resiliency projects for coastal adaptation to sea level rise and extreme storm events. And there they've really brought together people from the locals, local municipalities, state level, various practitioners, stakeholders, fishers, people from the energy industry, and brought them, into the room and had many discussions over a long period of time about developing projects, identifying projects that they want to do. And in many cases, these projects are blue or green infrastructure types of projects. So I think that has been a very successful model from some perspectives in terms of thinking about sustainable development, as well as addressing some of the impacts from climate change. And I had you could say the pleasure of reading many of the public comments. So I went through many of the public comments, and one thing that came up again and again is that the stakeholders, those especially from kind of disadvantaged or underserved communities, were at the table because real money was being put down. They thought, okay, if I participate, there's going to be a real project that's going to make a real difference. So I think that in addition to bringing people together, there needs to be some trust or belief that what their participation is going to amount to is going to be real change, and an actual change for the better.
We have a whole bunch of questions about this balance between top-down and bottom-up approaches, including several that speak to the question of what's the most appropriate role for governments and what have we learned from COVID-19 responses. And I want to personally frame that in the context of the big difference in the effectiveness of responses from government to government. And I was particularly moved by a New York Times article the other day that pointed out that national governments that are led by women have been consistently more successful at managing the COVID-19 outbreak than the average. Jalonne, what, in the context of empowering voices across all segments of society, what is the role of government?
Yeah, I think I heard that. I tend to watch The Daily Show, Trevor Noah, and I think that point was made about how effective a lot of the women governments have been in terms of responding to COVID. And I like high five both of my daughters. So anyway, the role of governments, oh my gosh. So I think there's a couple things, and I'll just speak from my experience in interacting primarily with the Environmental Protection Agency and even some state agencies, and when I worked for the State Department, for the Maryland Department of the Environment. So, when government was really, I won't say when, well, what I found to be most effective in working with the federal agency is when we had folks inside the agency that really cared about our values, our issues, our concerns, and that they didn't just create policies or write policies without feedback. So to me, a government that's effective is really not just about kind of getting a policy out and getting it on paper, but making it something that is realistic, helpful, enforceable, and meets the needs of the communities that it's trying to serve. So if it's protecting the health and environment for the people in the US, then that's what that needs to do. And so for me, a government has to be a good listener. It has to be a partner. It has to, I think, deploy the limited amount of resources in the best way possible, but also be creative about looking for other partners like philanthropy, like private industry, to fill in some of the gaps that they're not able to meet because of statutory and other requirements. I also feel like the government has to be, I would say, representative in a way of the communities that it serves. And I know that might be sometimes hard on the federal level, but when you get to some of the local and state level, it is nothing more frustrating to have someone representing you and making decisions and policies that don't really understand the day-to-day burdens that you're going through. So I think those are the characteristics that I think about in terms of the role of government. Unfortunately, I think government can sometimes be, oh boy, not as risky and not as bold in their actions as we want them to be, but then maybe that's the role of other partners. So for philanthropy, we're not doing philanthropy right if we're not taking risk and being bold. For the private sector, they have a different, kind of risk characterization. So to me, that's what good government, and when I had the most engagement with the Environmental Protection Agency, primarily, and some other federal agencies, is when it was like a partnership. We were on the phone, I was in the office, we co-created, again, in many cases, elements of the Clean Power Plan to address coal-fired power plants. That's when it was awesome. So, it can work, but it has to be like a true partnership.
And so sort of stick with this theme of the role of governments. Jenny, let me ask you a question. This comes from, comes from anonymous attendee. I don't know who it comes from, but it speaks to the fact that a consequence of the lockdown has been differential impacts on different people. And in many cases, the kinds of lockdowns we've seen around the country have enhanced the status and stature of the well-off and well-established, and have in some cases put marginalized people at even greater risk. And is there, what have we learned from that? I guess, was there a better approach, or was the kind of design of the social response really implicitly set up in order to enhance the structural relationships that had been in place for decades, centuries?
Right. I mean, I would, my experience generally with disasters is that, once the disaster strikes, it's difficult to make readjustments, right? Like, that's the power of preparation, right? Like, that's the power of planning. You need to sort of put things, you need to be set up right to be able to respond then. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis is a little bit different in the sense that it's a very slowly evolving disaster, and that kind of gives you a little bit more control, but not a total amount of control, right? Like, I feel like there certainly is, like, I think certain details maybe that you could have done a little bit better here or there, but I think as a whole, what you're looking at in that situation is, again, like the underlying dynamics of the society playing out as it usually does. And I think those kind of, these very intangible problems or sort of dynamics that we struggle with in many cases, I think that needs a long time to fix, right? Like these kind of, talking to each other, or like appreciating different points of views and empowering minorities. That's not a problem you can fix in a couple hours. That's something that you need to work on and need to take seriously for a long time. So I don't necessarily think that, like, that's not the kind of problem that you could fix that then and there. That's a problem we can start addressing now, and start becoming more intentional now. And I think one of the opportunities to me of the crisis is just to kind of have that problem stare into our faces as clearly as ever, right? And I think that's an opportunity to embrace that and kind of come up with an actual plan of how do we do this better. I'm not sure that in that particular moment, given that you needed to make decisions quickly and like broad sweeping actions quickly. I'm not sure that there is a huge opportunity of avoiding some of the disproportionate social impact. I think we kind of set us up in a way we're kind of seeing the consequences of past policy choices here, and you can't revert those in one moment, but you can revert those, or maybe guide those in a new direction over time. And so I think that's the key opportunity now, is to try to make that happen.
Gabriele, let me follow up on the question to you based on what Jenny was just saying about the time scale of the way that different kind of extreme events unfold. And we tend to think about a tornado or a hurricane that has an impact over a few hours versus COVID-19, which is obviously unfolding over months or years, and climate change, which has a series of spiky extremes that occur suddenly, but really unfolds over decades to centuries. And are there things we should be doing to better help people understand the fact that these extremes do unfold over very different time periods, but that the kinds of strategies that we've been discussing for dealing with them really are a kind of a coherent body of things?
Yeah, certainly. I think one thing that we are seeing now in quite stark contrast is that people are going to start to deal with, and are already dealing with, simultaneous crises. Earthquakes or typhoons as we're dealing with COVID. So we're starting to see some intersection between these disasters as they unfold. So addressing one, you need to address the other. So for example, when we're talking about the upcoming hurricane season, and we are encouraging people to prepare for that hurricane season, maybe some of the steps that they had taken, this is kind of short-term thinking, some of the steps that they had taken to prepare for COVID would well prepare them for the upcoming hurricane season. But then again, we need to be very clear with the public about recommendations. If we're going to ask you to evacuate, and we're also asking you to be socially distant, how can we give you sensible recommendations for what to do in terms of how to protect yourself and protect your family? So the messaging that we have around what people can do needs to be realistic. People are not, they know that this is very confusing. What am I supposed to do? And so I think that we need to think about the confluence of these disasters. It's going to happen more and more. And we're going to see some overlapping of these events unfold, even though they take place at kind of different temporal scales. But I think it does give us an opportunity right now, in the moment of COVID, to talk about some of these other things.
Right. We have about 10 more minutes left, and time for probably just maybe 3 or 4 more questions. I'd like to spend the last few minutes focused on questions about next steps, and I'll start with Jalonne. There's a question from Charlotte Keys about getting access to the resources, the stimulus funding that's already been made available for addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that we've seen is that the sophisticated, skilled actors have been very successful at getting access to the stimulus funds. Are there things that we as a society should be thinking about in order to enable the intended distribution of the funds that are made available to help?
Definitely, and I so appreciate that question, Dr. Keys. And I mean, so there's a couple ways that I want to answer that. One, which I know Dr. Keys is familiar with, is community organizing. And there are several national coalitions that have created platforms that are getting at specific ask, whether it's carve out of stimulus funds or making sure that a percentage of stimulus funds go to low-income communities and communities of color. And so for the next couple of months, with these bills, particularly around water and other things and COVID response, I mean, this is the time now to make sure that your voices are heard at all levels, and more voices make it stronger. And so again, I'm not telling Dr. Keys anything that she doesn't know. Getting in coalition with like-minded and unlike-minded people to make sure that they're carrying your message as well is super important right now. So this is a time where we have to elevate voices. But I think it's also an opportunity out, as I was just having a conversation with a federal agency yesterday about, you know, again, these certain folks want to understand what they can do to make the process better, because all of us are kind of responding in real time. You know, we're making changes, and, you know, so for me, this is an opportunity right now to help these federal agencies create a process that is going to work more in Dr. Key's community's favor and other communities' favor. So if we, whether it's the folks on this panel or other folks that have connections to these agencies, or if there's a way, there's a follow-up to this conversation, I think if there's a way to help community get connected to the folks that can inform whatever process that goes down, to make sure that that process does not have any of these ridiculous barriers in place so they can receive those stimulus funds, that is critical right now. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is reach out to my community of grantee partners after this conversation yesterday, saying they want to know what they can do better as a federal agency to make that connection and make it happen, because this is the time to tweak and change stuff that isn't working. And the only way that, again, we're going to be able to do that is by listening to folks on the ground that are not being able to crack the process. And so that's one piece. But the second piece is, I think it is so not rocket science, and a source of my frustration in seeing the COVID response, not only in my community in Michigan, but even across the country, and when I lived in Chicago and Dallas, is that not ignoring the obvious and not ignoring what the data says. And I think we have, and we know where communities are getting hit the hardest. And it seemed like it was so long before we actually began, and we meaning governmental entities at all levels, began targeting resources in those places that need it the most. It should not take that long. It's not rocket science. And so as we talk about government response, it's like, use the data that you have and target resources in those places that are most vulnerable and are experiencing multiple crises. And so whether it's tools like EJ Screen that are available, or working, again, more hand in hand with your state and local folks, like, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm making it simple as it is, but don't be afraid to follow the data, target and be intentional about where resources land. And once we reduce the risk for our most vulnerable, then everybody moves up. So if we take care of those folks that again are always getting the brunt, everybody's going to do better. So our response needs to be to target those that are most at risk by typically no fault of their own. So
that was fabulous. Thank you so much. Let me ask a question. This one comes from Canon Caracas Pulosoy, and it's about whether at the same time we think about building resilience, we also need to think about changing fundamental patterns of consumption, and whether there are big issues at the root of all of this, where small changes might make it easier to liberate the kinds of resources that are necessary. And Jenny, I don't know if you want to take a first crack at this one.
I mean, I think it is definitely an opportunity to make fundamental changes in how we think about things, and also, you know, like how we want to maybe change things. So for example, I think maybe not directly related to consumption, but one of the things that I think is striking here in the area is just the change in traffic patterns, right? We usually have an incredibly congested traffic network in the Bay Area, and now that's, you know, gone. And the roads are empty. And I mean, you know, obviously that's an extreme that we don't want to go to, and we want to have people, you know, everyone wants the flexibility of moving around, but maybe there is some opportunity for us to think a little bit more strategically about, do we really need to be at every meeting in person? Do I really need to travel to Europe for every conference, or can I just give those talks virtually, right? So I do think there is an opportunity to think about opportunities, and you know, like maybe we can shift more online, maybe we can reduce, you know, like or we can change our behavior in ways that are more environmentally and socially conscious. So I definitely like the direction of this. And I think it would be good to have more discussions that are also focused on what are maybe some of the silver linings of this crisis in kind of highlighting new opportunities for being more efficient, or, you know, like for being more environmentally and socially conscious. So I think it's a great idea. I don't have a general answer to it. And I think it will be it will depend on the individual communities and in people, what, you know, where they feel like there might be a way of doing it better.
Personally, I think the information content in today's webinar is a good example of how we can use technology to do even better. Let me ask one final question of each of you, and there are a number of questions in the Q&A that speak to where there are examples of co-creation of resilience paradigms that have been successful and not successful. Gabriele, do you want to take a first pass at that one?
So I mentioned one that is held up by many as being a very successful example of co-development of projects, and that's in the Gulf Coast, and that's in Louisiana. So it's the Coastal Master Plan, and that basically has brought in together practitioners and stakeholders through a series of workshops and meetings to basically identify a set of projects for coastal adaptation and coastal resilience, and then basically winnow it down to a select set of candidate projects. So that is often held up as an example of using decision support tools, having boundary organizations and stakeholders in the same room and kind of with populations or communities that they're trying to serve and actually coming to some solutions. So that is held up often as a good example. Examples of when co-development or co-creation doesn't work. I can't give you a specific example in terms of in my work, but there has been a lot of work done looking at power imbalances. Who gets invited into the room, and are those individuals also in positions of power, and are they really representative of the communities that they purport to represent? So I think some of those questions are in play, and so perhaps Jenny or Jalonne have some examples of when that might not work.
Denny, an example of a thought to lead us on aside from Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. It's a really good example.
Yeah, so I've definitely seen co-production fail in some of the community workshops, and I think the most common reason was fear. So, for example, if you I was in one workshop where someone showed a movie, a 3D, beautifully animated movie of this massive tsunami hitting a village and washing away the village in its entirety. And I think the impact of that video, particularly because it was such stark visuals, was just fear, it was just panic. And I think once you have fear in the room, nothing compares to it. There's just no force strong enough to get that under control. And so then irrationality takes over, and you know, like the discussion shifts into this very, very, I don't know, strange place in many ways. And so I think the key to me to co-production is, let's keep it rational, right? Like, let's talk to each other, let's listen to each other. I feel like the moment that emotions start taking over, you know, like yelling, crying, like just kind of this intense degree of emotions, it starts to be difficult to have a productive debate. So I think all of the examples that I've seen it failed were that. The other, I think, components that are important for making it happen is continuity of discussion, right? Like, don't expect to have one community session and have your eyes opened. It takes continuity. You need to build a relationship of trust. You need to actually listen. You need to allow for the possibility that other people might see the world fundamentally differently than you. And I think it takes some time. And so I think one of my favorite examples of co-production is here in the Bay, where Gabriele and I run a service learning course in which we interact with disadvantaged and underserved communities here in the Bay Area, like North Fair Oaks and East Palo Alto and others. And I truly treasure the conversations we've been having with them. They've been eye-opening to me in terms of what's the science we really need to do to move this forward. But I also just feel like it's elevated my understanding of what these disasters mean for these communities in a completely new way. And so I think it's the continuity, but also just the level of mutual trust, I think are two key ingredients.
And Jalonne, if there's a single message that's come through in this whole conversation, it's that everybody's voice matters. And how do we make sure that we hear everybody's voice?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and make this quick. So there are a couple of things that I was thinking about that make co-collaboration really hard. One, egos; two, silos; not listening; not having a community agreement; and not really being open to change. So being inflexible. So those are the things that came to mind as I thought about different experiences. I think it's also important that you understand what your role is in whatever the situation is, and having some humility. Oftentimes as a researcher, and I learned this early on, you come in, think you know all the answers, and you really don't. So realize that everybody has their own set of expertise, particularly the community. So humility is super important in co-collaboration. And I'll just finally lift up like 3 organizations out of many that do this very well. One, my former organization, We Act for Environmental Justice in Harlem, New York. CEER Coalition in Houston, which you can Google, CEER, and then also the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition in Seattle. They are all awesome organizations that have worked with government, with researchers, with community. I mean, they're awesome. So just want to lift them up.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you to the audience for a chance to explore some of the most important issues of our era. And I think that I certainly leave with a new appreciation of the role of individuals and communities in building back resiliently. So thank you so much.